Extension Forester. Glad to be here today to talk to you about establishing wildlife enterprises on your forest lands. What I'm going to talk about first is what is a wildlife enterprise, some of the revenue potential you can get from having a wildlife enterprise, and also how to build a successful enterprise. Well, first, what is a wildlife enterprise? Well, that can be defined very broadly. It's transactions that result that's mutually beneficial for you and for that person that you're leasing with or doing your enterprise with. It can be something that's not necessarily monetary. It can be something that you're doing just for in-kind purposes. It can be a way to do several different objectives, as we mentioned before about forestry. It might be you just want to pay your taxes or that type of thing. It can be for many different things, and we're going to talk a little bit later about agritourism. It can be for hunting and fishing, wildlife viewing, trail riding, hiking, those kinds of things. And there's many different ways that we talk about wildlife enterprises and little nuances with each one of these definitions. I mentioned agritourism, agricultural tourism, agri-tainment, ecotourism, nature-based tourism, natural resource tourism, wildlife associated recreation, and the term that I'm using, wildlife enterprises. So all those things kind of fall under this umbrella. But what do they all have in common? Well, it's getting access to something. Whether it be hiking in the outdoors, whether it be a pumpkin patch, whether it be viewing birds, whether it be access to the hunting. There are many different examples. We focus on wildlife enterprises. It can be deer leases. It could be fishing, dove hunts, duck blinds, viewing wildlife, guide services. It could even be some of these put-and-take bobwhite quail preserves. Why do we have this interest? And there's many different reasons, obviously, and you have your own interest in it as well, I'm sure. A lot of people, they want to generate income. It's to supplement perhaps a current timber operation that they already have, a farm that you already have, a business that you already have. It's maybe something that's compatible with something that you're already doing. As I mentioned earlier, maybe all you want to do is pay your property taxes. In some cases, people may not be interested even in the monetary value, but they just want to keep other people off. And so it could be a way to keep other trespassers from getting on your property. And in some cases also, you might have an idea and you just want to start really small and then grow it larger. Maybe you want to have a hunting lodge on your property at some point, but you need to start really small at first and kind of build up to that point. In the wildlife field, there currently is a debate that's going on about wildlife enterprises. It's not necessarily, I guess you would say, something that every wildlife biologist embraces in our field today. On the pro side, it's a way that we can put value on something, wildlife, that traditionally didn't have a value. Therefore, the train of thought is that if wildlife have value, people are going to invest in the habitat more likely. And then by adding this monetary value to that, then we're going to have more wildlife out there and more habitat. On the con side, however, leasing does change the way that we look at wildlife. Something that used to be considered free to everyone now has a value attached to it, and people have to pay for that ability to see wildlife, to go out and view wildlife, to be in the outdoors. And the example I like to use is that when I was going to graduate school in Texas, my major faculty member there, he could take me on a hog hunt because that didn't cost any money, but in order to go on a deer hunt, he couldn't take me on that because it was leased. I was a graduate student, I didn't have much money. And so I was limited in terms of the ability to go out and actually hunt because I didn't have the money to do that. And so on the con side, some of the biologists see us heading in that direction where there's going to be less access to people to these wildlife opportunities. So who really owns wildlife? And if we look back into the state and the federal legislation, wildlife is owned in common by all the citizens of the United States. However, the Supreme Court has said that the states have the authority to manage and regulate the taking of game animals. And in Arkansas, we talk about the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission as being the agency that's in charge of that commission. And their goal here is the control, management, restoration, conservation, and regulation of birds, game, fish, and wildlife resources in the state. And that's in our Constitution in Arkansas. Now, given that, there's also a federal part of this in terms of the management of wildlife, and that's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And they have authority over migratory species that cross all those state boundaries and also threatened and endangered species. So it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of the agencies that regulate these things. These agencies do work together to make sure, to ensure that we have wildlife available for our citizens. So what really are you selling if you have a wildlife enterprise? Well, you're not really selling the wildlife, and that's considered illegal and for many species. What you're really selling is that experience of getting outdoors, of actually hunting wildlife or doing other types of activities with wildlife, viewing them, photographing them. In Arkansas, we do have an Arkansas code that says that we have a right to hunt. That was an amendment that was made recently in order to confirm that indeed hunting is something that we can legally do. It's public hunting, fishing, and trapping shall be preferred means of managing and controlling non-threatened species, and citizens may use traditional methods for harvesting these wildlife species. There are some wildlife species, though, that you might argue that are, quote, owned, if you will, by the individual. There are exotic species or captive species. If you go into a pet store, you can find some of these there that have been raised in captivity, and you can purchase them legally and own them. There's also those animals that you can use as pets, wildlife viewing. There's some people go on hunts, for example, the pen-raised bobwhites that are released, and then you go out and hunt those. And you do need to check with your state agency, because oftentimes there are specific rules and regulations about those kinds of enterprises. And then there's always the question of feral hogs. And feral hogs, at least in Arkansas and Louisiana and other parts of the South, have become a huge issue. Formerly, of course, by their very name, feral, they at one time were domestic. So who really owns those? Well, I guess the way the regulations are set up is that once you once you actually kill that hog, it is yours. But every state's going to have a little different law when it comes to feral hogs and how those are handled. So what kind of revenue can you get from a wildlife enterprise? And you can look online yourself and find lots of data that's out there. One of the pieces of information that I'm going to be talking about is the National Fish and Wildlife Survey. That's conducted about every 5 years or so. So this last one was in 2006. The 2011 data have not come out yet. As soon as it does, I'd encourage you to go out and look for that. If you're developing a plan to have a wildlife enterprise, one of the things that's often recommended is that you have some type of impact statement. And this information here can help you collect that data if you're going to the bank and you want to show them how your wildlife enterprise potentially could get some money. So in the United States, there's 87.5 million participants that have spent $122 billion annually, and of course that was again from 2006. And you can see in terms of the types of activities that they participate in, hunting had 12.5 million, which and they spent about 23 billion. Fishing, this is 30 million, they spent about 42 billion. And the wildlife watching, which had the most participants, 71.1 million, just spent slightly more than the fishing in terms of 46 billion. As we look at some of the state data, though, we can see some of those numbers change a little bit. Here in Arkansas, we do have a healthy population of hunters out there. So anyway, but overall we have 1.4 million participants, which is pretty high considering we have, 3 million people in Arkansas. So that's a lot of people that are actually out there participating in wildlife and outdoor types of activities. They spent $1.8 billion annually. And in terms of the activity breakdown, in Arkansas we had 354,000 participants, but you can see they spent $789 million. So in terms of the three types of activities out there, hunting, fishing, and wildlife watching that we're looking at, the hunters spent the most. We had a lot of people that fished, 655,000 reported fishing, and you can see their expenditures there, $421 million. And then lastly, we had the most people were participating in wildlife watching, and in terms of the relative rank, they were second in terms of their amount of expenditures at $607 million. And if we break it down even further, just looking at our state data and how people are participating in those activities.
Becky,
Yes, sir.
Can I stop you a minute?
Yes.
Do you know how they figured the money spent?
They ask them, they actually ask them, and they break it down into many different ways, and you can look and see from the data. They ask You know, how much did you spend traveling? How much did you spend leasing?
That
How much
was
did you
one of
spend?
the things I was thinking about,
Mhm.
because I was trying to figure out how they were spending the money for wildlife watching. Now,
Yes.
I could see people answering that questionnaire that spent $3,000 on a family vacation to go to Yellowstone to look at the elk.
Right.
And I could see how those numbers, I was just wondering if they included that in there.
Well, and I kind of tried to do that a little bit in here. In terms of the wildlife watching activities, I said there are 1 million participants in Arkansas, but if you look at them, most of them were around the home types of wildlife watching. So if you're wanting to have a wildlife enterprise, you know, that may not apply too much unless you're selling bird seed or something like that to someone that they can use it around their home. Those that spent their wildlife watchable activities away from home, that was 43%, so right there we've cut out some of them. And what they did was observe wildlife, photograph wildlife, or feed wildlife. And when you break it down to the number of days, they spent 4.1 million days doing those things, but of those, only there were only 2.1 million trips. And you look at that, and here's I think the number that you were looking for, $264 was how much they spent average. So like you said, going to Yellowstone, where they might spend a lot of money on a family vacation, you know, these might just be a few days, lodging, meals, gas, and then a little bit for whatever they were doing, a little bit more money for that wildlife enterprise activity. When we look at hunting and fishing, we break that down by the number of days. And I didn't put down the amount spent on this one, but you can look that information up yourself. And I have a reference here to where you can go to online and find that. For the hunting, most of the hunting days were spent on big game, and then small game, and then some migratory bird information there. For fishing, black bass was the most popular, crappie, catfish and bullheads, panfish, and of course we do have a few trout in Arkansas, so there are some trout fishers out there that spent 960 million days doing that, and then white and the striped bass were how we would rank those in terms of Arkansas. In Louisiana, they have the coastal fisheries, which adds a whole new dimension to this breakout. There's some other information out there. Oftentimes we focus on hunting and fishing and wildlife viewing, but there's a number of other people who do other types of recreation, according to this National Outdoor Recreation Survey. 730 billion is spent annually, creating 6.4 million jobs. And you can see, as you were asking me, what are they spending it on? They took some money, some estimates based on the amount of gear they bought, shotgun shells and that type of thing. Trip-related sales, and then they added taxes into that as well in terms of the taxes generated from these monies. And this study actually did include the hunting and fishing data in it as well. But for bicycling, it's interesting. They had 60 million people participate in bicycling, and you can see there camping, paddling, and trails in terms of whether it be on ATVs or hiking or those kinds of things. And I went ahead and broke this out so you could see specifically those kinds of activities. You know, bicycling, we might think of it as being on paved roads, but there's a lot of people that like to do that off-road biking. Camping can be various different levels, from anything from primitive to RV types of camping. The paddling, there's people that canoe, but there's also another level of those folks that like to kayak. And in terms of the trails, there's all different, you know, we often just think, well, hiking or walking on a trail, but it could be backpacking, it could be rock climbing. And the 4-H Center here, and I guess this weekend or next weekend, they're going to have trail running out on their grounds, and they've invited people to come out and do that. So there's a lot of different other kinds of things that we may not have thought about that we could utilize as a wildlife enterprise on our property. This always interests me, that was in the same report, to kind of look at how this outdoor recreation and the expenditures made ranks with other types of industries that are out there. And telecommunications has a lot of these industries beat, but if you look at the active outdoor recreation, I mean, that's a pretty good chunk of money that people are spending to do these things. You know, even looking at the motion picture industry, which, you know, we always hear about how much this movie made, and I mean, they're only about in the 80 billion area. So it is a good way to get some supplemental income if you look at it from this perspective and you think broadly about the different ways that you can utilize your land. At least according to that, there's a demand out there for it. But you might, as we mentioned, Bob, if you're looking specifically for this information and you want to dig a little deeper, the U.S. Census Bureau and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are the one that published that census information. They also have birding information. They have wildlife watching broken down. And then they also have waterfowl information broken down. And then I found also online a report that Game and Fish did that looks at the wildlife watchable recreation that you were asking about. Of course, that's a little bit old, 2001, but still it's some information that we have that we can use to get a handle on if we're going to do something like this on our property. And how much income can you make from something like this? Well, I always hate the word "it depends," and I'm going to show you some of the things that it depends on. But the location, the type of wildlife, whether you have trophy wildlife, if you have something unique like the elk on your property or near your property. Do you know what a lifer means? No? If you're a birder, a lifer, birders keep lists of all the birds that they've seen in their life. And so, common birds like chickadees and cardinals easily come off the list. But there's some birds out there that you just don't see. And the trumpeter swan, for example, is one that we have in Arkansas. And some birders may have never seen a trumpeter swan before, so that's considered a lifer. People from Europe might come over to the United States and do birding trips, and so they don't really see a lot of the same birds that we have here. And so for them, that experience is going to add a lot to their list. So when they see a bird, for some people, maybe a bald eagle might be that lifer bird for them. The other things that you provide, like if you provide amenities, that can add to how much income you can make, and how much you market can also influence how much income you can make. These are some of the variables that I've seen that can contribute to the price that you can ask for your land. It could be the county you live in, like how many people want to go duck hunting in any place other than, Arkansas County. I mean, that's where we think of. We think of duck hunting. If you have something in Arkansas County, it's going to be associated with that species. The amount of acreage that you have, the species you have available, there's a place in Mississippi, Terra Wildlife. All they do is promote to bow hunters and bow hunting for their deer operation. So it could be that your preferred harvest method might influence the kind of price that you can get. The way that you ask for the money, are you asking for it in a per hunter, or are you asking for it per acre, can influence how much you can ask. Are you getting a day lease? Like if it's for mourning doves, you might want to split it out and make a day lease out of it. But some of these leases include dove hunting as a part of what their whole package is. The total number of hunters that you're allowed to fill the lease. So if you have one hunter per 40 acres versus one hunter per 300 acres, that's going to affect the price that you can get. The amount of deer harvest information that you can collect. So if you know that you're going to have a hunting operation and you're going to try to attract people who enjoy hunting deer, you might want to keep track of the antler size. You might want to keep track of the Boone and Crockett score, the buck and doe ratio, the average age of the deer that you have harvested, the number of deer that you've harvested, and provide that as a part of your package so that people get an idea as to what they're buying. The number of years that you've been managing your land can have an influence. If this is something that you've just done for a couple years versus something that's been going on for 20 years, and the practices that you've been able to do in the 20 years, like prescribed fire or thinning your timber. The number of feeders, the number of blinds, do you use food plots? Is there livestock out there? If it is, are they going to be out there when we're trying to hunt? Is fishing allowed? So you might have, your focus might be on deer, but if you have that pond there, that pond can add value for the people that are coming out there. Lodging, do you have a cabin out in the woods with no water, no electricity, no plumbing, versus something else that's on the higher end? How about road accessibilities? I notice sometimes on these announcements that they have, it indicates that the only way you can get out there is with a four-wheel drive, or maybe even ATV, or maybe you have to even walk in some of these places. Are guests allowed? Is alcohol allowed? All those things need to be considered when you're describing your property. In terms of what you can get for deer leases, and this is just, you can do this as well, and it's gonna vary, you know, from time of year, from year to year. But what I did is I went out and I just did some searching on different sites about what people are asking for deer leases. And in that looking around here in Arkansas, it ranged from 83 acres to almost 4,000 acres of what they were leasing. It ranged from 3 hunters to 24 hunters. It ranged from 91 cents an acre to $36 an acre. Of course, the $36 an acre, and here's one for $144 an acre, it included a cabin and some really nice amenities. The range of pricing was anywhere from $350 a hunter to $1,500 per hunter. And of course, as I mentioned before, many of these included other game species or multiple game species rather than just one species. For the waterfowl, this gentleman who's a farmer said any hole a duck landed in the last 10 years will bring $600 an acre, you know. So again, there's some hot spots in the state about what you can ask for. You can get money for $10 to $30 for flooded rice fields. That was in 1999. So, you know, it could be a lot higher than that. It could be lower considering what the economy has been like recently. So you just need to kind of check around what people are asking in your area. There was a 600 acre tract that had apparently some folks that were willing to pay $100,000 annually for that tract of land to get access hunting on it. On the website, ranged anywhere from $2.33 an acre to $150 an acre. The leases tended to be either seasonal or annual leases, 80 to almost 3,000 acres. The duck day lease, $150 a hunter is what that going rate was. For dove hunts, now I took this information, you understand, in February, but it typically is a $50 to $100 per gun. One gentleman told me if you add a barbecue to it, you can get $200. These listings found in February, you know, kind of off season, was anywhere from $58 to $250 per hunter, from 340 to 520 acres, and the dove hunting, as I mentioned before, a lot of these species are just lumped into one. So you can either get a day lease on the doves, or you can do something that's just as a part of the whole package that you're selling. There's several things you can do to get the pricing different from the rest, if you will. The guide services that you provide. If you want to do an individual guide, you go out, you show them where the animals are, you show them, you take them there, and you're in a vehicle. You get them everything they need, get them set up, ready to go hunting. The semi-guide, you might drive them to the site, and then you say, okay, here's a blind here and here and here, and then you just send them out. The self-guide, you hand them a map and say, here's the places that you can go. So for each of those levels of service, you can get a little bit more compensation for those. If you have lodging, if you have meals, if some people come from out of state and they may not have the equipment, or they may not want to transport what they have with them. So if you can rent them equipment, and some people don't like to get their hands dirty, so if you can clean and process the meat for them, you can add for those kinds of services. Some of the other things that people do that are in the wildlife enterprise business, dog training and boarding. There's one gentleman I met from near Damascus area, and that's how he actually got into his enterprise. He had a dairy farm, and he had bird dogs, and he wanted to train his bird dogs. And as he was training them, he says, well, why don't I have some quail out here and let other people come and use my bird dogs or bring their own and come out and train and enjoy it. And it just slowly evolved into a business. He had his dairy operation, and then he had this put and take quail operation that he has. You can have shooting range. What are the people going to do after they go hunting in the morning, or they go hunting in the evening? What are they going to do the rest of the day? So you might have a shooting range. In Mississippi, paintball operations are really taking off. Something that you can do with some land that you have. Game bird breeding. If you don't want to, if some people buy their eggs or they buy their quail from other places, but you can do that yourself if you want. Horse, ATV, trail riding, hiking, birding, fishing, all those things are these ancillary activities that add value to your enterprise. And what do you want to do if you want to have a successful enterprise? And I guess we're going to be repeating ourselves quite a bit here. For the forest part, you have to have a plan. For the wildlife part, you need a plan. For agritourism, you need a plan. And all these things should be considered in your plan. Business considerations, the type of thing you're offering, what do you have available currently that you can use, the liability, legal issues, the financial feasibility, marketing, do you have people skills to do it? And then we're not going to get much into the resource management, although, you know, you do need to have really good land, you do need to have habitat management and maintenance of that habitat if you're going to have a wildlife enterprise, and how you manage those populations on your land, and as well as knowing how, you know, what the state is doing in terms of managing. So, you know, it could be your land, a county, a regional area, as well as the state. So all these things need to be considered to be successful. The type of experience that you're offering is a part of your plan. Are you going to be leasing the land with no amenities? Very easy to do. But again, the payback that you get is not as much as if you're offering guide service or if you're offering these meals and lodging. The resources you have available, if you already have that blind that's out there and somebody's hunting deer from it, in the off season there might be some people who want to be taking pictures out of that same blind. So if you have that in your inventory, think about how you can double use it. If there's anything lacking, if you have labor, some people that get into wildlife enterprises make sure their whole family is involved. And so this one gentleman I was telling you about that had this quail operation, he had his kids in charge of raising the quail chicks, getting the eggs, incubating them, hatching them out, feeding the quail. Well, once his kids went to school, he said, "Oh, I don't want to do that anymore. I don't have the labor." So he ended up, now he buys his quail from another source. So you need to think about all those things as you're developing your plan, and if you're planning to do it for a while, think about it in the future. In terms of the legal and liability issues, which is what we're here today really to focus on, like Carol said, we have some people here, Rusty and Elizabeth, who are going to get in more detail about these things, but just to look at it from a hunting perspective, there's several things to think about. Posting your property, danger signs. There's a game and fish regulation about hunting that you have to have written permission from the landowner before you can hunt on that property, your written contract, your insurance, and which we've already talked about, and your release agreement or indemnity. In terms of posting your property in Arkansas, and of course every state is different, so you're going to have to check with your state laws, but in Arkansas the requirement is that you have to have written consent of the owner or the leasee to enter posted property, whether that be that your property is posted with signs or with paint, and we have a specific paint that we have in Arkansas. It used to be that, you know, that this was when this law came out, this is what it had to be. Now you can go to almost any store and say you want posting paint, and the paint store knows what it is. They know what this formula is. So you don't have to worry about that too much anymore. But it is a very specific paint that we use, a specific color. The signs, there's also requirements on the signs. If it's in forested land, these signs have to be 100 feet apart. If it's on cultivated or more open lands, they have to be 1,000, they can be up to 1,000 feet apart. And of course they need to be very visible. They have to be, the letters have to be 4 inches high, and then certain words on it, posted or no trespassing. The hunting regulation that I spoke about before, Arkansas Game and Fish says that you have to have permission to access private land before you can begin hunting on it. And what that means is that you have to have some kind of, it says a verbal or written permission from the landowner. If the property is posted, as we described before, or fenced, according to state law, it must be written permission. And it says that if you're a relative, that you don't have to have a written permission, the verbal permission is sufficient. So if you're going to do this, you're going to have somebody leasing your property, then you need to make sure that this law is covered. The written permission must have the name of the person on the property, signature and telephone number of the landowner, and the beginning and ending dates of the permission period. As been mentioned before, we don't allow, handshake agreements are no longer advisable. It's just not something that we even hardly talk about anymore. It's almost a given. Basically, hunting leases are a contract, and so you need to have that legally formalized. The insurance, of course, we've already talked about having to have that insurance, being able to ensure that if something does happen on your property, that when you get sued, that you have the insurance there that can help provide the attorney as well as anything else that's needed. If there is a case, the funds that have to be given out for that type of situation that may have arisen. But you need to notice too that you need to, if you check with your insurance company, some people say, well, I'm already covered, but you may not be covered. So be sure you sit down with your insurance agent, describe what you're doing exactly, and see if it falls under that incidental business pursuit. But what we find in most cases, it does not really fall under that incidental business pursuit under the current policy that you have. So just be sure you talk with your insurance person and then get with someone else if you need that additional insurance. Your release statement, is it worth it? And that's a question that we often